Hello, everyone. I'm Meg Woodside. As Gina said, I'm a trustee with the Woodside Foundation, and that is a small family-held foundation that focuses on asset building. I came into social work in 2005 when I began my MSW at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. After a 20-year career in banking and financial services, including the credit counseling agency, and also then a shift into several years of corporate philanthropy, which is where I began my philanthropic career. The foundation was created after I finished my degree in order to focus what I had learned with my new role as a social worker and address what I was most passionate about, which was building financial and economic stability for families, primarily focused in Maryland. And within a year of that, I had the good fortune to meet another alum of our program, Robin McKinney, with the Cash Campaign of Maryland. And we created what has now become the Financial Social Work Initiative at the School of Social Work, which I'm very proud to have Jody leading, and I'm very proud to have Chris be a part of for nearly 10 years. So it's my pleasure to be here to facilitate a conversation with other funders. I'm really excited that we have such great experienced funders with us today from both the corporate funding sector, and an independent family foundation, I should say fund, that's a multi-generational family fund, and also an independent foundation, which is very mission focused in our space. Just a little background about how we're going to do things today. It's going to be very similar to the other panels. I'll provide the background of all of our speakers actually in reverse order. And we'll take a couple Q&As from the chat after each speaker has about 10 minutes to introduce themselves and their work and what their organization is focused on. And like I said, we'll just do a couple Q&As if they're in the chat. And then if not, we're going to have a facilitated conversation at the end, which will be very informal, much like the one we just had, with everybody participating. And I would love it if people would put their questions in the chat. If there's a particular presenter you'd like to address it to, please note that. And also, Gina, I want to make sure that I remind everyone that we'd like you to use the Padlet feature at the end to give us your comments. Before we begin, I just wanted to spend a sec talking a little bit about terminology to inform our conversation. And there's two things that I just wanted to highlight and ask the speakers to address in their comments. One is the distinction between funding basic research, or what we consider to be research for the value of acquiring knowledge and science. And the other is funding applied research, which is really more the focus of our conversation, where you're conducting research to actually solve a problem, solve an identified problem. And it's more than just gaining knowledge. So that's one aspect that I would like the presenters to discuss in terms of their interest in the types of things that they fund. Do they fund pure research for knowledge, or is their interest more in the applied research area, or is it both? And the second terminology that can sometimes be a little bit of a mystery in this arena is the distinction between grants and gifts. And funders and philanthropists often use those terms interchangeably. But in the academic world, I have learned in my role with the Financial Social Work Initiative, a grant and a gift are not the same thing. They are often accounted for differently. They carry, in many ways, they carry different overhead aspects. They carry different reporting requirements, and they're not the same animal. So as folks talk about their work, if there are distinctions between that type of funding or grant making that you're doing, it would be helpful, I think, to give us that insight. So let's begin. I'm going to apologize in advance for reading my notes, but I'd like to introduce our last speaker in reverse order, Sarah Bainton-Kahn, who is Vice President of Corporate Responsibility at JP Morgan and Chase. In this position, she manages a grant portfolio of national nonprofits focused on financial health, housing, disability inclusion, and consumer rights. She also collaborates with strategic nonprofits that are involved in advocacy and thought leadership to support low and moderate income communities. Prior to joining the firm, Sarah worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. During that time, she helped start the Office of Financial Empowerment and developed and managed the Bureau's work related to financial coaching and access to credit for economically vulnerable consumers. And before her time at CFPB, Sarah was the program manager for financial stability at Goodwill Industries International. She's also worked for the National League of Cities, where she focused on the Bank on Cities campaign, which we're familiar with, an effort to connect underserved consumers to lower risk financial products and services. And she worked for the U.S. Senator Jack Reed. Sarah has a dual undergrad degree in sociology and Spanish from Villanova University and a dual master's degree in social work and policy from the University of Pennsylvania. And she serves on the board of the Change Machine with May, who kicked us off earlier this morning. Our second presenter is Padmini Parthasarathi. Padmini is the Senior Program Officer for Economic Security at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. She manages the fund's economic security grant making to help low-income adults and families achieve economic security and upward mobility. And prior to joining the fund, she was a program director at the California Wellness Foundation, overseeing statewide grant making to advance the Affordable Care Act and healthcare reform and promote employment and asset building opportunities. Before that, Padmini was a program manager for Kaiser Permanente, where she managed its nationwide community health needs assessment and worked for Contra Costa Health Services family, maternal and child health programs, leading an initiative to incorporate asset building into maternal and child health programs. Padmini serves as the co-chair of the Asset Funder Network's National Board of Directors and Bay Area Chapter Steering Committee, and serves as the co-chair of Rework the Bay and volunteers for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. She is a 2021 Council on Foundations Career Pathways Fellow, and she has also been a fellow in Grantmakers in Health's Terrence Keenan Institute for Emerging Leaders in Health Philanthropy, and she's an inaugural member of the Justice Funders Harmony Initiative Leadership Program. She earned her master's degree in public health from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's degree in psychology and social behavior with a minor in sociology from UC Irvine. And our first speaker, Dr. Jill Jones, is Managing Director of Research for the National Endowment for Financial Education, which we know as Nephe. Her responsibilities include research and evaluation efforts through overseeing the grant cycle, directed research, scholarly engagement, and the evaluation toolkit. She strives to bridge the connection between research and practice and supports best practices in research and evaluation. Prior to joining Nephe, Jill was a senior research consultant at Hanover Research. She worked with over 250 higher education institutions, K through 12 districts, state agencies, and nonprofits during her tenure at Hanover. Through her work, she helped manage and produce the creation of actionable and high-quality empirical research and evaluation for clients. Jill earned her doctorate in education with an emphasis on research methods at the University of Virginia, and she has a master's degree in education from the University of Maryland, EA, and a bachelor's degree in management and organizational behavior from Case Western Reserve University. Jill, I'd like to invite you to kick it off for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg, for the introductory remarks. And thank you to the entire FCAB community for being so welcoming. I'm delighted to serve on the panel today. So I am Jill Jones, the Managing Director of Research at Nephe. So whether you've known us for years or just getting to know us, I wanted to highlight our direction. Last year, Nephe launched its first ever strategic plan, and we updated our mission and vision. We hope that everyone here shares our vision for a nation where everyone has the knowledge, confidence, and opportunity to live their best financial life. Our mission is to champion effective financial education. We do that as an independent, centralizing voice, providing leadership, research, and collaboration to advance financial well-being. Before I discuss our funding priorities, I wanted to mention why FCAB community is so important to us. We understand that social work is on the forefront of understanding the broader personal finance ecosystem and the types of foundational and idiosyncratic factors that shape an individual's financial capability and well-being. For example, we know that financial knowledge is not the only factor that contributes to financial well-being, and find resonance in the research that's happening in the social workspace. Your acknowledgement of the ways in which background, family socialization, policy, access, all play critical roles in shaping an individual's financial well-being and are essential for everyone in this space to understand. For that reason, we're thrilled to support this conference, to learn more from the great presentations that we've heard here, and to support the important research that you're all doing in this space. And we hope to continue connecting with everyone here and scholars that are doing really important work. Over the next few minutes, I'll outline Nephe's research priorities in detail. The four main components as an overview are a focus on measurement, systemic inequality, youth, and data and methodological biases. So I'll start with measurement. As you heard another scholar, I heard another scholar state earlier today, and I was very excited about the research presentation. Strong standards of measurement strengthen the case for effective financial education, and there's often not synergy around how we're defining these things. So Nephe seeks to improve the quality of research in our field by evaluating whether our instruments are effective in their measurement. We are interested in reevaluating current financial literacy metrics and how financial literacy, behavior, perception, knowledge, and skill can be measured most effectively. So, are instruments effective in their measurement? Are they grounded in theory? What new measures should or could exist that would address these gaps? And are measures sensitive to diverse populations? We've had a lot of great conversations about that throughout the FCAB conference. So this last point is particularly important for us. Many research studies fail to make the important step of systematically testing to what extent measurements speak to varying audiences. This might not happen because of the requisite sample size isn't there for specific subpopulations, or just an unintentional omission on the researcher's end. And we want to make sure that as we're talking about, instruments that have generalized and been used with broader populations, that it's not just that broader population that it was validated with, it's every subgroup, race, gender, ethnicity that we're incorporating into that inquiry. The next research priority I'll elaborate on is systemic inequality. We acknowledge that financial education alone cannot solve the economic inequality that exists across socioeconomic status, race, and gender in the United States. We see financial education as one piece of a broader ecosystem that affects individual financial capability and well-being. So we asked, to what extent does financial education play a role in driving equity across populations? How can it bridge the many gaps and meet diverse needs of individuals and communities within our country? We encourage the investigation of knowledge, skill, and wealth disparities, especially among populations that statistically are more likely to experience systemic barriers to improving their financial well-being, such as Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, and girls. It is also essential to consider the framework of intersectionality when examining population-based disparities. So we pursue this through the lens of looking at effective pedagogies, culturally competent curriculum, programs for educators. The next one is perhaps when you first hear the title, it's not the sexiest title of all, but data and methodological biases. So specifically as it pertains to personal finance, helping us identify knowledge gaps in our field. By being more inclusive, we can broaden both our research design and data. So for example, I'm sure a lot of you have consumed research where you probably didn't realize that the only people included in that research are individuals who have a credit score. That misses a lot of individuals who don't have credit scores and are not scorable. And so who is traditionally missing from our data sets and from the analyses that we're conducting? Alternatively, what populations are always being studied? And how do we give voice to those who are traditionally unseen and unheard in the data? Finally, a focus on youth. So we recognize the exposure to financial education among youth in the United States can vary widely based on the presence or implementation of state mandates and the amount of financial socialization and education within a family unit. Such a wide range of formative experiences creates an inconsistent foundation for the knowledge and skills critical to financial well-being and decision-making in emerging adults. So what are novel approaches to measuring the efficacy of state mandates or the equivalent for local jurisdictions? And what family socialization and foundational factors need to be assessed and looked at further? I should say we're not asking that all research concepts address all of these research priorities, but these are the areas of focus that and the types of research projects that we're really excited to fund in the upcoming years. So to answer a few of Meg's questions that she posed at the beginning, looping back to that. So one of them was the type of research that we fund. It tends to be more basic research, but it's really important to us that it has a practitioner, policy, focus beyond the research itself. So I think, most people who are in the academic space are familiar with, I heard someone say earlier today, I'm so happy someone's reading my research articles, and that's sort of a testament. Sometimes we're just reading each other's work in our own spaces. And so it's really important for us that that work gets translated into a broader audience, and that we are thinking critically when we're funding a project and working with a grantee about what that application will be after we funded the research. So it has a practical slant, though it tends to be more in the basic research area. And then in terms of gifts versus grants, we fund in the form of grants. We have milestones that go along with the grant progress and the grant's life cycle. So we check in regularly with our grantees and try to serve as a resource and collaborator as they're working out different aspects of their research design or in the analysis phase, and really appreciate that collaboration that we get through the process. So Meg, I don't know if you have any additional questions about those two components specifically, but I will stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jill. You answered both the questions. That's great. I'm looking in the chat right now, and of course, looking for questions. Does anybody want to spontaneously ask a question at this point? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. I would like to elaborate a little bit on the fourth one, because the remarks that Julie Birkenmeyer made earlier about her study indicated that there really is a dearth of research in the field of financial socialization, which I'm really personally interested in. But when we talk in Maryland about this work, we talk about how financial capability is really a part of your social capital, and financial socialization is a framework or a term that we can use to kind of expand on that notion that the concept of social capital is bigger than a lot of people. It has more elements to it than a lot of people initially discuss. But I think we're definitely moving in the right direction. So if we were to try to examine the elements of financial socialization from a research perspective, do you have any thoughts on how that research might proceed? What we might examine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give an example of a study that we recently funded in this domain. So an individual who's working in family and consumer sciences, and she essentially found this sort of lack of, like, we don't even have a consistent instrument that we're using to measure family socialization. And so she's specifically looking at family socialization that's happening for people who are 18 and younger, because we know, just like when people hit kindergarten, they have a lot of educational background that they're actually bringing with them only at the age of 5 that sets the trajectory for their educational development. The same thing that we see, it's not like when someone turns 18, they have the same background as everyone else does when they're turning 18 in terms of family financial socialization. And so in this study, she targeted individuals who are 18 to 30 years old, and was an emphasis on, like, what are the key components that define family socialization. So is it, talking to your parents? Is it having experiential opportunities, so hands-on learning experiences? So I think it really depends. When we talk about financial socialization, that socialization can happen through one's life stages. So imagine if you're coming upon a new financial decision that you haven't made before, there's a level of socialization with the types of information and knowledge that might be necessary for you to know just in time. And so I think it's important to, expand. Like, I think the focus on youth is really important, but that socialization really does happen throughout our lifespans and life cycles as we go through different financial transitions, whether that's we're gaining our own financial independence, whether that's we are entering a partnership with someone else, and that we're sort of like co-creating our money management strategies with one another. So I think there's a lot that goes into that socialization piece, and a lot of different ways that we can go about measuring that and understanding, the importance of when is it appropriate to have certain levels of socialization, and what does that socialization look like.
We use a tool, and I'm sure this is also used elsewhere, that we have called the financial genogram, and it's a sort of a tweak on the typical genogram that social workers learn how to do, and it diagrams your financial socialization. And what's fascinating is, after you're done with this and you kind of learn where your values and habits and attitudes may be coming from, we don't further dissect it in terms of, well, did you so now you know how you feel about your relationship to money and you've learned some things, but where did you learn them? I think that would be a really fascinating next thing to go to. Did you learn it at the family table, at dinner? Did you learn it in school? Gosh, that's a whole other topic. Did you learn it in the community? Did you learn it by asking a friend who may not have any more information about it than you did? You know, what is your source of this financial socialization, and how can we learn about it first so that we can shape it, and how can we develop ways to influence it positively? Okay. Does anybody else have other questions for Jill about Nephe and the type of work that they fund? I know, Jill, that that Nephe has in the past developed its own curriculum as well in the space of financial education, but that as you're looking to change your direction a little bit, that's not something that's going to be the most, I guess, the biggest part of your portfolio, even if you do plan to keep it. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what Nephe was doing and how it's moving away from certain things and towards others?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Meg. So we made the decision to sunset our education curricula, and we announced this in late 2020. So previously we had our sort of three bigger programs that we had retained over the years, was a high school financial program, the cash course program, and then Smart About Money. And all three of those we are retiring. We didn't want to, and we did this based on market place evidence. We didn't want to duplicate efforts of other program providers by developing something new that was sort of capitalizing on the strengths of our existing programs. And relative to when Nephe first launched our first financial education program, the field is in much, much better space now and is supported by a variety of nonprofits, states, and schools. So retiring our programs allows Nephe to focus our efforts on the critical initiatives to help advance the field. And so with that, we'll be, looking to be a nimble organization that continues in some areas that we've excelled in before, supporting research, elevating quality research to the field, forming connections among scholars in different disciplinary areas, and understanding research trends in the field that help inform our research agenda and research collaboration. So amplifying some of those areas that we were working on before, but putting more dedicated resource and energy into some of those spaces and learning, how can we best position ourselves as a thought leader in the field and bring people along in the important mission and values that we have.
I do have a question from the chat about whether Nephe funds qualitative research.
Yes. And I don't know how much I emphasize this. There's, one part of it, like, what are the unheard voices? How do we give voice to those? And I think, that some of the ways that we've articulated our funding priorities speaks to we tried to speak to qualitative research. Obviously, when you're talking about measurement, that's definitely speaking more of a quantitative lens. We find a lot of value in qualitative research. And there are lots of, when you look at the variety of individuals conducting research in different disciplines, there's a variety of methods used, and we're definitely in support of qualitative methods and find a lot of value in the richness and the narrative and the experiences that can be portrayed with that specific methodology that you don't always get through a quantitative methodology. So yes. Okay,
great. And my last question is, are there any particular populations or age groups that Nephe is particularly interested in?
We do have that focus on youth, which is definitely an age group, but that doesn't mean it's at the exclusion. We think that, someone's financial life, it's their whole trajectory and lifespan that's impacted. So we really don't have exclusions on, what populations we're interested in studying with the research that we fund. Thank you.
Oh, right. And I knew about the youth, but I was just curious, in social work, we look at populations beyond just age groups. We look at particular circumstances as well.
Oh, great question. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I was fixated, obviously, as you can tell, on age based on the context. Yeah, so I think some of the funding priorities that I spoke to in terms of systemic inequality, like definitely Black, Indigenous, people of color, girls, women, those are areas of focus in some ways, because we know in terms of financial capability and well-being, they're not in the same position as peer groups might be. And so those are definitely focus populations for us in general.
Fabulous. I'm going to read one last question from the chat, and then we'll go to Padmini. Does Nephe fund social work researchers, family and consumer economist researchers, and others? And that was from Julie Berkmeyer.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Julie. And Julie, I really enjoyed your presentation earlier today, and I have on my list to follow up with you. So thanks for the question. Yes, we do. We definitely recently there are several family consumer sciences programs that we have funded just in the last few grant cycles. In addition to people who are sort of like cross-disciplinary or either teams that are cross-disciplinary. So disciplines include, as you can imagine, econ, social science, consumer family behavior, sociology, psychology are sometimes backgrounds that folks bring to the table. So, it's such a diverse field in terms of the disciplinary perspectives. And we see that as, it can be a challenge sometimes in that we don't all speak the same language, but we really do see that as the beauty and benefit of being in this space, is having so many diverse disciplines represented.
Great. Well, thank you. Appreciate you spending your time with us, Jill. Really great to hear from you and from Nephe.
Thank you, Meg. I appreciate it.
At this point, I'd like to invite Padmini to join us and share a little bit about her work and her organization.
Hi, thank you, Meg, and thank you to the conference team for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor. And I have the utmost respect for social workers, particularly because of my background and career in public health, where I've had the privilege of working with many social workers across my career, and many that had dual social work and public health degrees, and we're bringing that expertise to public health work. So I'm excited to be here. As Meg said, I work for the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, which is a private family foundation in San Francisco. Our mission is to foster a healthy, just, and vibrant society in the Bay Area. We're a local funder with some regional and state level investments. And I know you're all joining today from all over the country, but I hope that what I'll share about our work, even though it's more local, will still be resonant and helpful. The fund's four main portfolios are arts, education, economic security, and Jewish life. We also coordinate and support an arts pooled fund called the Creative Work Fund, and we support more modest sets of work of disaster preparedness, basic needs, and other mission-related efforts. And in the past year, as you can imagine, we have really focused on supporting our grantees in their response to COVID-19 and the pandemic, much of which has come from the economic security portfolio, but also in other areas of our work. So I want to dive more into the economic security portfolio, which is the program I oversee and which is most related to the work you all do. The North Star of the portfolio is closing the racial and gender wealth gaps. And that includes the many intersections between race and gender, with economic justice for immigrants, older adults, LGBTQ people, and people with disabilities. All of the strategies in the portfolio, including financial capability and asset building, roll up to this North Star around closing the racial and gender wealth gaps. In addition, there are two overarching themes in the portfolio that cut across and are weaved throughout the grant-making strategies that I'll share shortly. These two themes are the care economy and the health-wealth connection. And I won't go into detail right at this moment, but I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A if folks are interested. So under that North Star and those overarching themes are three main strategy areas in the portfolio. Each strategy includes both direct service and policy and systems change grant making. And to the questions that Meg posed to us in her intro, I do fund applied research from time to time, and particularly research that's focused on informing policy change. And again, getting to closing the racial and gender wealth gaps. And our funding is always in the form of grants. We primarily fund 501c3 organizations and government agencies. We do not fund 501c4 work. So I'll tell you a little bit about these three main strategy areas in the portfolio. So the first is income support and public benefits. So it includes, again, both direct service and policy work related to things like EITC, SNAP, and guaranteed income. The second strategy is what I just call work. It includes a range of things, including workforce development, programs and policy, and worker organizing and worker rights work. And then the third area is wealth building and protection. And this is where the work on financial capability and asset building lives in my portfolio, including grants that are focused on financial coaching, savings, including things like child savings accounts efforts, retirement savings. We are fortunate in California to have a secure choice program called Cal Savers that started a couple years ago. There's work around debt and credit building and repair in this strategy area. And this area also includes small business development, including their incubation, TA to small businesses and access to capital, community wealth building, and public policies that help people build and protect their assets. And populations of focus in both financial capability and the rest of the portfolio include BIPOC individuals and families, immigrants, including those that are undocumented, women, particularly BIPOC women, older adults, and people with disabilities. And I also am very interested in the portfolio in intergenerational strategies, or what some people call 2-gen strategies. But I like to say intergenerational because many families are living in situations that are more than 2 generations. And then I wanted to just share generally some of my thoughts and tips about working with funders, particularly more maybe community-based funders in your region, private foundations, which is the types of foundations that I've worked for. So I think there's, of course, the obvious, but I will say it anyway because it's amazing how many times this actually doesn't happen, is research the foundation or funder and the person you're talking to the best of your ability. I know that not every funder is very transparent. The information you can get, say, online really varies. But if you can get that information, I would say, take note of their process. Like, is it an open LOI process? Do you need to be in, is it invited? Like, is it invite only? Somewhere in between. Take note of anything they explicitly say about their funding priorities, especially what they don't fund. I know that some funder websites will actually say, like, we don't fund, X, Y, and Z. And sometimes that's actually even more helpful than what they do fund. And I would say, because information can be limited that you can just find publicly, see if any of your other funders know the person or funder you want to, or foundation you want to talk to. They might have intel they can share with you that you wouldn't find on a website. Like, do you need to really develop a relationship with that person before they'll consider funding you? Or do they just want you to submit an LOI and they just, read everything and make decisions? Are there nuances to their areas of interest that you wouldn't be able to, find on a website? We, as funders, often, we talk often, we spend time with each other, we work together on strategies, we serve together on collaboratives, we strategize. And so all the time we are sharing information with each other about our work, about who we want to fund. We sometimes fund the same grantees or contact each other when we're considering, funding an organization. And if you have a funder that can make an introduction for you to another funder, that's always a great strategy. It, in a different world, it would probably be great if that didn't matter, but I think in the world we're in, it does matter. And we get so many emails and requests, so that recommendation, often really helps. When you do have that conversation with a funder, again, this sounds so basic and obvious, but just, let's say, really listen to what they're saying about what they're looking for, what to include in your LOI or proposal. I know that as a program officer, I'll say, I need you to really make the case in this particular way, because that's what my boss and my board are looking for. So really take to heart, those tips they might give you. Again, it sounds maybe obvious, but it's amazing how many people don't listen to what you're telling them. So I just want to really emphasize that. And if they very clearly tell you that your work's not a fit, listen to that as well. I feel like it's part of good customer service to be really upfront. Like, I'm not looking to lead anyone on or waste their time. I also want to use my own time well, but for the nonprofits we fund, their time is so precious. I really don't want them wasting their time. So hopefully other funders will be as upfront. I know they all are not, but in most cases, I think they will be. And to the point around research, kind of grants for basic research, or versus maybe the more applied type of research or community-based work that I fund. Just a couple thoughts about that. In our grant applications, we really are not looking for the super technical, language or academic language. I think plain language is actually a gift to the program officer. Often, just saying what you mean and what you're going to do as clearly as possible. Doesn't need to be flowery, like just the nuts and bolts of your work. And that's partly because many of us as program officers are generalists. Like, you heard how many different things I fund. I didn't even get into all the details. And I'm expert enough to make good grant making decisions, but I will never be the in-depth expert that most of my grantees are in their particular area, whether it's small business or EITC. They're organizations who focus on their one thing and they know it very deeply. And so I want to learn from applicants and grantees, but I likely won't know all of the jargon, especially when it comes to policy that can be really wonky sometimes, or even in terms of research methodology. So, and we read a lot of LOIs and proposals. So, the easier and clearer to read, and to follow, the better. And then I'll just say, I think on a more maybe human note, most of the program officers that I think you'll encounter, and I'm just maybe talking really about myself, but that, we're in this work for the same reasons you are, to improve the lives of people in our communities. Most of us have some kind of experience on the ground before coming to philanthropy. And I know that there's definitely an uneven power dynamic between funders and nonprofits. I fully acknowledge and own that. I think that's important. But we're also people who want to truly know you and your organization and learn from you about how we can support you to help you do your work better. And again, I can only speak for my own experiences, but we also have our own organizational priorities, boundaries, challenges. We have our bosses, we have our, boards. And I try to be really open about those things with grantees, whether it's saying, like I said earlier, I need you to help me make my case, to my boss, or sometimes I made the best case I could and it gets declined, and I'm pretty, I'm as honest as I can be about those things. But even if your program officer isn't or can't share because of, internal reasons, I think it never hurts to ask. And I think understanding those constraints, or challenges might also help you just understand the funding decisions better, the processes that they use that might give you insights into your experience with that funder, and into, and might help you in future application processes with other funders. And last, but definitely not least, don't be afraid to push us. I know that it can maybe feel unsafe or scary to do that with someone from whom you need funding. But I think you will know with whom and when it makes sense and where there's enough trust to do that. If you find a funding partner who's really open and interested in changing and growing, I think sharing your feedback and your suggestions is so important. I know that I wouldn't be the grant maker that I am now without the grantees that have challenged us, questioned us, and supported us. You know, one of my goals in philanthropy is not just to be a good grant maker, but to really help change the field, to be more focused on justice and equity, and moving power to communities, you know, from philanthropy. You know, the idea of like working myself out of a job would be great. And when I'm trying to spark change in my own organization, like being able to say like, well, this is what grantees are saying, that actually has more influence and sway, I think, than me just sharing, you know, my own opinion with my executive director or trustees. So I'll close here, and then I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you all might have in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Padmini. I enjoyed that. I'm sure everybody else did too. I'd like to reflect on one thing you mentioned about the volume of letters of inquiry that you get. And everyone's process is different. You know, some funders will have an open mailbox and anybody can request anything any time of the year. Others have very structured cycles. Others are by invitation only. And what I'm curious about with your work is it a two-way street? In other words, mail's coming into you, but do you as an organization ever go out into the community and commission research around something, or a project or a pilot around a particular problem you want to see solved? And what does that look like for you to go out and say, this is something this is a question I have and I want an answer to, and how do I go about finding somewhere to make a grant for that kind of research?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say, you know, my values and philosophy are that, you know, the people closest to the problems are closest to and have the best solutions. So I really do try to ensure that my grant making is in line with what nonprofits and the communities they serve are telling us is needed, or what research, you know, experts in these different areas are telling us, you know, need to be done. That doesn't mean I don't have ideas, you know, but I do. If I think of something where I'm like, oh, is anybody looking at this question, you know, or is there data on, you know, whatever it might be, then I will, you know, I will go to the folks who I think might have some answers for me and talk about it with them. Like I'm not really interested in just making it up on my own and just saying, well, this is what I think I should do. And funders do that. I mean, that's a one way of doing grant making, and philanthropy can help advance a field by kind of thinking ahead. You know, we have the advantage of the big picture often and can see where there's gaps or where there's needs. And I take that seriously, but I always want that to be informed by what's really happening. And especially in being a local funder, really community based, you know, it's not I don't want it to be a kind of ivory tower approach. I really want it to be informed and resonant, and also not, you know, the more work I do around justice and equity, you know, not wanting anything we come up with or create or decide to fund to be perpetuating inequities. And research has a history of doing that, I think, in some communities. And so I'm really mindful of that as well.
Thank you. I'm wondering what you see the role of social work in the broader ecosystem of the work you're doing in the Bay Area. And I know the Asset Funders Network, of course, is national. And I'm wondering, when you're looking, you collectively, AFN, the membership, folks in the philanthropic world, when you're looking at issues in your silo of work, whether it's economic security or housing or whatever, do you view schools of social work that are in your area as places of expertise that you can go to and learn about what perhaps they're researching on, or new interventions, evidence-based practices? Do you include that sector in your own ecosystem of knowledge sharing?
That's a great question. I will say that it was this connection with FCAB and this group that actually made me think like, oh, I didn't know there was this whole kind of area of specialty, you know, in social work per se. I knew more about it from the health side of the social work's role in the health side of my work. I have some experience. I have grantees, especially in workforce development, that do partner a lot with social work schools, because the social work students will provide you know, counseling to their workforce development clients, for example. And often students are really helpful to them because they don't have the money to hire like full-time, you know, full-time psychologists, for example. And so they'll partner with social work programs, you know, for that kind of work. I don't think that some of the asset building or like financial coaching programs that I fund have partnered with social work schools, but now that I'm learning more about it, I'm actually eager to talk with them about that and make those suggestions. You know, we have multiple schools of social work here in the Bay Area that are that I think would be great partners. So yeah, so I think I haven't seen it as much, and but I do think that would be a great addition to a lot of the work that my grantees are doing.
Well, I think that'd be a great outcome from the conference. Well, thank you. Does anyone have, oh, I see one question in the chat before we move to Sarah. Let's see what we have. Okay, yes, we'll come back to that. So let's, thank you, Padmini. Let's go throw it to Sarah. If we could switch speakers and invite Sarah to join us.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's really nice actually to be among so many social workers. So I have a social work degree and I don't get that privilege very often. So it's really nice to join you all and just hearing the kind of conversation in the session before and the way that social work has been infused in this conversation has been really nice. So I was also asked, similar to Padmini, to take a step back and not just focus on the research, and I will get to the kind of the research that we're funding and the way we think about research, but to take a step back and to talk a little bit about our approach to grant making as well. So JP Morgan Chase is obviously, we're a corporate funder. We're a very large bank. We fund internationally. My funding is domestically focused. And we have, where all of our funding is kind of consolidated into corporate responsibility. And so with, you know, a lot of companies call it CSR, corporate social responsibility. We call it corporate responsibility. But we are really charged with wearing two hats, I'd say. So my one hat is my grant making work, and I have a portfolio of about 70 national nonprofits that span racial wealth equity, civil rights, disability, inclusion, financial health, and housing, consumer protection. But then I'm also charged, as are all of my corporate responsibility colleagues, to take what we learn and bring it back to the company. So to push the company to do better in everything that we do. So for example, in the financial health space, or we call it financial health, but financial capability or financial well-being, that could mean if we learn a good workplace savings, if we're funding a good workplace savings program and there's a research component and we learn really great insights, we're expected to bring that back into the company and push HR to do better. And that's actually happened. We launched a financial coaching initiative for employees last year. So it's been, you know, I think fun to do that. And it's really nice to work for a company that appreciates the insights that our grantee partners and the research partners, the work that they do. But it means that one of our driving principles is, you know, thinking about how do we leverage what we call the full force of the company in kind of everything we do. The other driving principle is inclusive economic recovery and resiliency. For a long time, it was inclusive economic growth. But then last year with COVID and a lot of the racial justice reckoning that we had as a country, we shifted quite a bit. We sort of didn't drop all of our key pillars and our overarching, you know, goals, but we thought, wait a minute, we need to take a step back and be responsive as funders. And so that has shifted the way that we think about funding for this year and probably into next year, thinking more about the resiliency. And I'll come back to that because I think it raises a lot of interesting research questions for our field that has thought, in some cases, more about longer term asset building, recognizing the shorter term, medium term outcomes that are required for the longer term. But then now we're thinking more about the resiliency, the emergency aspect to it. How does that connect to the resiliency piece and then the longer term piece? And then I mentioned how we're connecting to the business. We're also thinking about what's our role as a large company in driving other companies to think collectively about important issues such as racial wealth equity. And so we joined forces with a number of large companies last year that are part of something called the Business Roundtable to make a commitment. And our company commitment was $30 billion over 5 years towards racial equity and justice. And but just using that kind of forum and that venue to really push other companies to do more. And so part of our commitment, 28 billion of that will be what the bank does or what the company does in terms of housing, small business, and there's a lot of financial health work too. Again, I mentioned bringing ideas and bringing them back to the company. One aspect to our financial health work as a company that's part of that commitment is to train. We just hired a number of what we are calling community managers who will be placed in communities around the country. They'll work with the banks, with the branches, but we're training them as financial coaches so that they can go out into the community and they can work with nonprofits and work with even customers in a way that's much more professional, much more authentic. And we're working with the AFCP on that. So it's a professional trainer also. In terms of the philanthropic side, going back to that for a second, we have 4 pillars in the foundation, and that's financial health. I'll get back to that in a second. Small business, jobs and skills. And then we have a large portfolio around affordable housing and neighborhood development. And so I'll focus on financial health because I think that's where the mind is right here, where most people are interested. In terms of 2021 and what's on our mind, it's no surprise racial wealth equity. But it's not just kind of what we fund. And we fund work such as Prosperity Now's racial wealth divide work. We've been funding that for about 7 years now. We fund a number of work focused in the communities, but it's also looking at how we fund and really doing, benchmarking analysis. How many leaders of color are we funding? When we look at our entire portfolio, what's the share of investment in nonprofits led by people of color versus white-led organizations? What's the board makeup? These are questions that we didn't really ask ourselves. We would sort of ask, informally, but we didn't actually, really look at it, I'd say, philanthropically wide. And then now we're holding ourselves accountable to doing better and thinking more intentionally about how do you think about the intersectionality of some of the issues. So, for example, I fund disability work. How do you think about the intersection of race and disability? And so that's another kind of thing that we're really focused on. We continue to, as we continue to be in a COVID world, 1 year later, it becomes not so much a short-term strategy. Last year, we shifted a lot of our funding to immediate, maybe some flexible funding, general operations. Now we're moving into year 2, and suddenly we feel like we need to know how to measure this. Like we'll be focused on COVID-focused, grant making for this year and probably into next year too. And we still want to be responsive and nimble, but now we want to know, how do you evaluate what works? What kinds of metrics do you use to even understand if you're doing a good job? We'll still fund what we consider our more evidence-based strategies like financial coaching, but also continue to look at techniques that are potentially more scalable and cost-effective, like using technology. I know there was a panel earlier that focused a little bit on technology, and trying to unpack what are the key elements of that interaction that really need to be in person, or maybe not in person, but what are the elements of that in-person interaction that make it so effective? And then how do we make sure that when we move to technology, we're not losing something in that process? So that's a research question right there. And then of course, cultural competency, something that we fund in our work, both nationally and locally, but it's our bank now will continue to fund it and think about where our gaps are, but also our bank now on the bank side is interested in how they can embed some of those lessons learned into the work that they're doing. So that's just a quick overview in terms of our philanthropic focus areas. I'll pivot to research and then happy to answer any questions because I know I've been going through a little bit quickly. So the research work that we do is in two categories. One is we have something called the JPMC Institute, and it's our in-house think tank. It's also in corporate responsibility, so it has more of that, a little bit more of a mission focused, external mission focus. And we use our data, all the data that we have access to, so millions of customers, and we, of course, de-identified, aggregate, don't worry, no PII, and we look at sort of trends, economic concerns. If you look on the Institute's website, you can see the kinds of areas they're focused on, very much COVID response, so the impact of COVID, but also the impact of the measures like the economic stimulus payments and forbearance, stuff like that. So we're looking at both COVID impact on customers as well as, the impact of the response, if that makes any sense. And then also in addition, like basic things like household spending, debt, small business, health, some labor metrics too. So we produce a lot of that, research, and we, in some cases, our grantees inform that research. In some cases, that research informs our grant making. So I have a couple of examples of how we've done that too. And then the other way that we interact with research is obviously funding it. And so I can share with you some of the research agenda ideas at the high level that we have more in the financial health space. And then I have a couple, just tips, I guess, in terms of the way that we think about funders and research. So we're looking at resiliency, like I mentioned, and that sort of, I don't know if you call it pipeline or that transition, the pathway to wealth building. What does that look like, and how are people successful? It is kind of that just basic understanding, but it's also how do you move somebody along that pathway? Certainly savings, like writ large savings, not so much again on the really on behavioral stuff with savings. Really worker financial health is a big issue. So what are the right suite of benefits? There's a lot of question around how workplace financial health should be delivered, by whom, what is the employer's role? Should it be completely third party and separate? Does that impact the impact? And then the question around paying. So, there's apparently some research that shows that when the company completely or employer completely pays for it, it tends to get less usage versus somebody paying in part for some of it. So how do you figure that out, right? That like balance. And then government services and policies. So thinking about financial resiliency and how that intersects with government policies and programs. And then applying a racial lens to research and figuring out the best models to integrate the data where needed. So as a bank, the Institute, there's a lot of fair lending federal rules that preclude the bank from collecting race-based data for very good reason. But what that means is we don't know the racial makeup of our customers, and there's some exceptions like housing and for HMDA, but it means that we don't always know. So our institute has found workarounds to using voter rights data to figure out the racial makeup or what they project to be the racial makeup of customers, but it's a real barrier. And so it's something that we are often trying to tweak. How do you do that? There's been some conversations around how, should we open up the conversation with the federal government around collecting more race-based data? There's a conversation around small business data and bringing in race-based information there too. So that's sort of research, a little bit on the research side. And then I'll just mention the advice. So I think, Padmini, you kind of talked about this. I always say to my grantees, please tell the story. The research is fantastic. What I need is the story to tell, and be it like to share, kind of this is what we funded and why, and here are the outcomes. But it's really about field building too. So we want the work that we have invested in to we don't want people to replicate it and to spend money. We want people to build on it. So if you have a research component, really being able to, in a plain language way, as somebody said, really just explain, what are the key findings so that we don't end up, spending time and energy on that same kind of question or set of questions. In some cases, I understand that you need to replicate research to look at other aspects or to make sure that it was valid and all that. But, a lot of times as funders, we want to just build on things. I also think, I was going to say, think about impact. So when we think about impact, often it's for better or for worse, replication, how does it inform policy? So when I say like impact research, I don't mean like has to be an RCT evaluation. I just mean what's the why? Well, what's this going to inform? And then in terms of kind of getting in the door, we do fund some researchers, I'd say. We fund Urban Institute quite a bit. We fund some researchers like that. I think partnering is a really good idea. So if you don't just go out for research funding for that sake, but partner. If you're into program evaluation or into a certain topic area, partner with a nonprofit doing that and provide that research component. That's the best of both worlds, because the nonprofits often don't have the capability, they're running a program to do the research component, but yet that's kind of the missing piece. So it brings the best of both worlds together. So I think I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you. That was great. I appreciate that. Any questions from the chat, from the other participants? We've heard so many different nuggets that I really think are great takeaways today from so many different perspectives. Thank you. I am mindful of the time that we're very close to our finishing time. And the last group to go is not the one that you want to have run over. Do any of our panelists want to say anything that they maybe forgot to say or thought that they'd like to just add as a closing remark before we go? No? Okay. Well, I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did. I can't thank you enough for your generous time and your thoughtful participation. It's great to have an opportunity for such experienced funders to bring their perspective to a group of people where, as it was mentioned, we all are really trying to do the same thing, but coming at it from different places. And I think that this will form a number of hopefully new, productive and fruitful avenues for the social work field to take and run with. So I want to thank you all at this point. Without further questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Gina and Margaret to close us out.